According to the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, extreme makeovers are in. One of the more recent statistics from 2020, coming out of the pandemic, in that year alone, there were more than 15.5 million cosmetic surgeries in the United States. The top 5 were as follows. Number 1 was nose reshaping. Number 2 was eyelid surgery. Number 3 was a facelift. Number 4 was liposuction. And number 5 was chest construction. How about those extreme makeovers? You know, this side of the cross and the empty tomb, extreme makeovers are in. That Easter means that Jesus Christ is alive and he is on the loose, breaking into the hardest hearts and homes to bring children to him. And Jesus, when he comes into our hearts, he doesn't just enter to rearrange a few misplaced things in us, but Jesus enters to completely make us over from the inside out. He works in us to shape our speaking and thinking and doing and being and believing and behaving to be more and more like him. We have one word for all of his kingdom construction in us. We call that transformation. And so for these 8 weeks after Easter, beginning last week, we're going to walk slowly and dive deeper into just 2 chapters of the Bible. John's Gospel, chapter 11 and 12. We're going to look closely at the story of Lazarus and see just how much transformation Jesus is working in you and me, and he wants to work in all of his baptized children. Last week, Pastor Micah kicked off the series with the first 3 verses in chapter 11. I want to go back there today because it really sets the context for verses 4, 5, and 6. John writes, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother, Lazarus, was ill." John, with his careful, detailed account, lets us know exactly where we are at there in our text this morning. You can see on the screen where Bethany sits. It's about 2 miles on the east of Jerusalem, also on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. Their village was there. Interesting, archaeology in the late 1800s discovered a burial cave. That's a picture of it right there. And inside that burial cave was an inscription of the names, right near Bethany, Martha, Mary, and Eleazar. Eleazar's the Hebrew name for Lazarus. It means God helps. Remember, when the Bible wants to emphasize something, it often does what? It repeats it. Notice that twice already in the first 2 verses, John notes that Lazarus was ill. Now, we don't know what his illness was, but he was definitely suffering some kind of debilitating ailment. And we know from the next verse that it was getting really severe. Because look what his sisters, Martha and Mary, do now in verse 3. Therefore the sisters sent to Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, the one whom you love is ill. That's now the third time in 3 verses. There's at least some level of faith here in Martha and Mary. They know that Jesus is a resourceful man. Already in John's gospel, he has turned 160 gallons of water into 160 gallons of wine. He's already taken 5 loaves of barley bread and a couple fish and fed over 5,000 people. He's walked on the water. He healed a man born blind and an invalid for 38 years. Many of these people Jesus probably didn't actually know. So certainly, if we send word to Jesus that, Lord, the one you love is ill, certainly Jesus can help. So let's look at how Jesus responds when the message the sisters send finally reach Jesus. When Jesus heard of his illness, he said to the disciples who were with him, "This illness is not for death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God might be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When therefore Jesus heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed in the place where he was for 2 days. Does anything sound a little strange there? A little off? Maybe even a little sour to your tongue? When the dire news of Lazarus' condition reaches Jesus, he doesn't drop everything he's doing and come to the rescue. Jesus doesn't go into some kind of rapid response mode. Jesus doesn't even tell the disciples he's with, "Hey guys, get a really good night's sleep tonight because we are leaving first thing in the morning to walk all the way up to Bethany." Jesus hears the news and he stays exactly where he's at for 2 more days. Jesus, where are you when we need you most? Why don't you show up? Why do you seem to tarry? The question is not just what is John teaching us about Jesus and his work of transformation in us, but how do we respond in our own lives when Jesus seems to tarry? When our most fervent prayers seem to go unanswered? We're going to call that the in-between. Like Mary and Martha, as they are waiting for the in-between from when they sent their message to Jesus to when he will come. What do we do when we, like those sisters, find ourselves in the in-between, waiting on Jesus to show up? Let's look at 5 biblical truths about that in-between. Truth number 1 is that this in-between time is absolutely necessary for our transformation. It's an essential part of the process. I know in our instant culture, we like things now. We want download speeds faster and faster. We want instant food. We love those microwaves. But the process of transformation, the in-between, can't be skipped. It can't be shortened, nor can it be sped up. It reminds me of a story I read about one particular emperor moth. A woman found a cocoon on the ground outside of her house one afternoon, and so she took the cocoon and put it, little grass in the bottom, and put it in a box and took it into her house. And in just a couple days, she noticed quite a bit of movement near the opening of that cocoon. The moth was fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting, trying as hard as it could to make its way out of that little opening, fighting and fighting and fighting. And as it continued its struggle, she felt compassion for it. So she thought that she would help it out. And so she got a little pair of those scissors and snipped the opening to that cocoon to make it wider. And sure enough, almost immediately, the moth crawled forth. Yet something was wrong. The body didn't look right. And for its very short life, it was confined to walking. You see, when the emperor moth is fighting and fighting and fighting and struggling to make its way through that little opening, the blood is pushing from its fat body into the outermost parts of its wings so that when it finally emerges, it can fly. Our transformation process, our in-between, is a lot like that emperor moth. It is a slow process that has to be undertaken. For it is in our own fighting and wrestling in the in-between that God is strengthening our faith, preparing us, growing us, so that we are ready for the plans that He has in advance for us to do. It's in our own struggling that He is strengthening our faith to a full life in Jesus Christ. The second truth about the in-between is that the hidden God is always the working God. We can imagine how Mary and Martha felt as they were waiting and waiting and waiting for Jesus to show up. And even today, sometimes it feels like Jesus is unnoticed, that He is uninvolved, that He is quiet. Yet even in those times, we know that Jesus is still Emmanuel, God with us. I think of the barren winter months around here, when the trees are bare and the ground is frozen and the grasses are all brown, and it seems above ground that nothing is happening. Yet even in the barren, cold winter months underneath, sap is still flowing. Cells are curing. Change is happening. And it's the same with our God. Even when the sisters waited for Jesus to show up, Jesus was still at work in His hiddenness, perfectly carrying out the will of the Father. And it's no different today. And did you catch truth number 3? Twice again in our 3 verses. John tells us that Jesus' default posture towards every one of us is love. Even when we are in that in-between. The sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is ill. And in verse 5, John told us again, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. The cross and the empty tomb. Easter is God's eternal stamp of how much you matter to Him. And so even in our own in-betweens, we hold on to that posture that we know that God is love, even especially to us. Truth number 4. The highest goal is always God's glory. Recall Jesus' words in verse 4 when He told His disciples, "This sickness is not for death, but for the glory of God." That Jesus Christ is always working in our in-between and always working for the glory of the Father, and also then we of the Son and Holy Spirit. So that in our in-between, in our transformation process, this is something that only God can work in us. A true, selfless faith, where we, in faith, can substitute "the" at the beginning of that number 4th truth to my highest goal is always His glory. So that in faith, we too can say, I want God's glory more than my own remission from cancer. I want God's glory more than a pregnancy. I want God's glory more than my dream job or house or comfortable retirement. I want God's glory more than anyone and anything else in my entire life. And here's the thing. If God can use my health or my hardship as a platform for His glory, then I will not only welcome whatever it is into my life, but I will always give thanks. Because in our transformation, we can say, my highest goal is always, always God's glory. The last truth, but by no means the least, is that in our in-betweens, I trust His master plan for me. Jesus had a master plan for Lazarus and his sisters. And that will come out later in this series. But we know the same is true for us. God knows His master plan for you. He knows His master plan for me. And even when we don't have all of the answers, even when we are in the in-between, whether that in-between is an empty house after divorce, or that in-between is another day without employment, or that in-between is waiting yet another medical result. Even when we don't have those answers, we know and trust firmly that He holds the master plan, and that the God of Easter has everything in His hands. And as we wait on Him in those in-betweens, we have the Bible's promise in Philippians 1 verse 6. that the God who began this good work of transformation in you, He is the God who will bring it to full completion in the day of Jesus Christ. I want to leave you with some questions to reflect on this morning in our time. I'm going to push a little bit at the end. What is one of your in-betweens right now? And what is Jesus calling you to do as you wait on Him? And please get to number 3, in faith. How would you finish this sentence? I want God's glory more than my. Think about that. If you're with someone, go ahead and have some conversation. And then we'll close with a blessing in just a moment.